landowning groups the whole way along the coast to oversee this process. And they did this through a community-controlled impact assessment, funded jointly by the state government and by the lead proponent, private sector proponent, who had established the first LNG precinct inside the industrial park. Just to quickly illustrate a couple of the features of the consultation and the impact assessment. One issue in the Kimberley is that life is very much organised around gender. So political life, cultural life, law, as Aboriginal people talk about it, which is a lot more than culture. You have women's law and men's law. You have women's cultural activities and men's cultural activities. You have generally what's referred to as men's business and women's business. And often these cannot be discussed together. So, as in this photograph, you often have people meeting together with both genders, but at particular points in time an issue would come up and it would be necessary to break up. So the meeting would break out into women's meetings, part of a meeting there, into men's meetings. But one of the things that had to happen was that the Kimberley Land Council had to make sure that there were men and women technical support staff available always, so that when you wanted to have a breakout meeting like this, you could have a woman who could go and talk to the women about technical issues and provide technical information, and a man who could do the same with men. I have never seen this happen in a conventional impact assessment process. It's demanding, it makes it more expensive, because you have to some extent, you have to duplicate the technical expertise, and you minimise that to the extent that you can, but you can't avoid it completely. But it means that you get a level of engagement and a quality of engagement that you simply cannot get in this particular context if you insist that people only have access to consultation through open community meetings. The way in which information is prepared and presented. The Kimberley Land Council undertook an extensive process. It produced newsletters every 2 months to keep people up to date. The middle one in the bottom, a lot of people in this area, English is their third or fourth language. Their English language skills are very limited. So the Land Council produced essentially comic book type material, which people, even with very limited command of English, could understand and read. Also produced a number of these things in translation into different local languages. One of the critical points is that almost all of the information dissemination is done by Aboriginal people themselves. But it's not done by consultants. In this case, you have a number of Aboriginal leaders up the front and part of the Land Council team, and they went round all of the individual landowning groups week after week, providing people with information about this, providing it to them in languages that they understood, in context that they could understood, able to answer questions. Two final slides. One that emphasises the iterative nature of the process. The Land Council found that when people were provided with documentary information, they often had questions. And the Land Council came up with the idea of actually getting all the players involved in this to come and meet with the Traditional Owner Task Force and actually answer those questions and provide additional information. So what you can't see here is these photographs are taken from the crowd, in a sense. So there are 60 or 70 Aboriginal people sitting in the audience. On the right-hand side, the diminutive figure in the middle is the lead negotiator for the oil company consortium. Now, the oil company had provided a certain amount of information. The landowners had lots of questions about it, so they invited her and her team, who were standing up there, to come to the meeting. They would spend half a day, sometimes a full day, and people would ask them question after question after question. In some cases, the oil company wouldn't be able to provide the answer immediately, but they undertook to go away and get the information and come back. On the left-hand side, environmental groups. These represent all of the major environmental groups in Australia. The Wilderness Society, the Australian Conservation Foundation, Greenpeace, various other organisations. They were taking a strongly oppositional approach to this project. The traditional owners wanted to know why. They wanted to know what information these people had that was leading them to oppose the project. So they invited them all to come to one of their meetings, and they quizzed them and they scrutinised them. And they asked them really hard questions, like, if we provide or inform consent to this project, we as the traditional landowners, are you still going to oppose it? This sort of process leads to a level of information sharing and information provision that is worlds away, in my experience, from typical impact assessment undertaken by a consultant for a proponent or a borrower. And finally, in terms of shared knowledge and mobilising shared knowledge, one of the things that the traditional owners also insisted on was that the site visits by teams that were assessing the physical environment should not be conducted, as they almost always are, by, quote, scientists and non-Indigenous technical specialists, but that they should be done jointly, and that the knowledge of traditional owners and the knowledge of Western science should be combined and brought together. And that's what they did, and these are some images of the teams at some of these different sites that they were assessing in terms of the LNG precinct. So, quick summary of impact assessment. But there are other issues, major problems ensuring implementation of impact assessment findings. This isn't something that's confined to the Indigenous context, it's general. Across the board, there is a huge problem in terms of impact assessments being undertaken either as part of the decision to provide a loan to lend money, or as part of the decision whether or not to approve a project. And once that decision is made, once the final disbursement goes out the door, once the mining company or the oil company has its approval, they tend to sit on the shelf. And that's what Indigenous people were finding. They would put a lot of effort into impact assessment, but once the politicians had their project, once they could cut the tape and open the new project, they lost interest. Once the mining company got its approval, it was too busy building the project to worry about anything. Once the lender had made the final disbursement, they moved on to the next project. So what do you do about that? Implementation failure in relation to conditions attached to loans. Absence of ongoing monitoring. Most of these projects are very long life that we're talking about, either big infrastructure projects or big extractives. No LNG project in the world has been closed yet, since the very first one was built. Typically, they are designed for a life of 50 years. Often they will have a life of 100 years. How do you make sure that after 10, and 20, and 30, and 40 years, anybody is still paying attention to what's going on? This often results in growing community frustration and conflict. We've seen this all over the world. And again, a quote from the IEG review, which talks about vital gaps in managing environmental risks, and that implementation and follow-up were deficient, even in projects for which environmental assessment had identified serious risks. So, here is where the second mechanism comes in, impact and benefit agreements. These are legally binding agreements negotiated between Indigenous communities and state authorities and private sector developers. They include community consent, typically to the granting of interests in land that will allow extractives or infrastructure, but very importantly, that consent is usually qualified by a requirement that it only persists as long as the other parties meet their obligations. Again, this is a fundamental issue which is much broader applicability in terms of ideas about free, prior, informed consent. One of the major issues in debates in that area is whether or not, if Indigenous people provide their consent, it's one-off, it's forever, there is no revoking it, and they then lose their bargaining position. And these agreements, yes, people give their consent, but their consent, their ongoing consent is conditional on the performance by the other parties of their obligations. They contain provisions to ensure that community shares in project benefits. Typically, they cover the entire life of the project, and this is something I really want to emphasise. The IBAs that came out of the community consultation process, I explained to you for that LNG precinct, have a life of 99 years. They're multi-generational. They provide, for example, just one specific provision. They provide that the Government of Western Australia must, for every one of the next 99 years, employ a full-time compliance officer at the LNG precinct to make sure that environmental legislation and the provisions of the agreement are being implemented. They are now routine in Australia and Canada. About 100 IBAs were signed in Australia in 2012 alone. They're growing quickly in developing countries. A version of IBAs called development agreements are now a legislative requirement in Papua New Guinea. They're being signed in New Caledonia and in other developing countries. They're moving beyond extractives, for example, agriculture, infrastructure, urban redevelopment. And they're an adaptive mechanism. I want to stress this. They can be adapted to all sorts of different situations. The sort of IBA that you have for exploration is very different to what you will have for a major project agreement. Typical features of an Indigenous IBA will be that there will be a recognition of Indigenous rights in land, again fundamental, consent, provisions to ensure access to employment, training and business development, in most cases revenue sharing provisions, and provisions to manage impacts in terms of cultural heritage, environmental management and so on. Critically, implementation mechanisms and mechanisms for ongoing review. Finally, IBAs place community in a position to negotiate benefits and impact mitigation, not just to be consulted or to participate. That's a fundamental shift. Is that these emerge from a negotiation between parties, not from one party in a position of power consulting or having participation from. They're a mechanism for establishing consent, and so central to implementation of the principle of free, prior, informed consent, and to the World Bank concept of broad community support. I mean, many of the bank's policies or aspects of its policies talk about broad community support. But how do you know when you have it? What mechanism do you use? This mechanism can help you. Covers the life of the projects that impacts can continue to be addressed. And increasingly, they contain within themselves mechanisms and resources for ongoing monitoring, review and adjustment. I'll leave it there. Happy to provide a bit more information on some of those details in the discussion. Thank you.
Time's running out, so I'm going to be brief with my comment, and thank you, Ciaran, very much for enhancing, I think, many of the ideas that many people have in this room. But what I want to do is go immediately to the challenge and put it in that context so that you keep it in mind. And that is, the government structure is really important to keep in mind. You have strong Indigenous communities, you have strong land rights, and you have a strong governance structure of the country. We at CAO, we've had a discussion with Ciaran and we've considered some of these aspects. The situation in Canada, the situation in Australia, that we think this is an easier, or not an easier place, but the climate is there to ensure that an ESIA that is done with Indigenous peoples has a better place for nourishment than in some of the countries that we have to work in, where you have weak land rights for Indigenous communities, you have a governance structure that is very weak, and you have an Indigenous peoples communities that have also been fractured over time. Now, I pose that not to say that it can't be done. That is the challenge of an institution like the World Bank Group, is to work with Indigenous in countries where there are those challenges. And I think this poses a bigger challenge, particularly in the review of the safeguards for the bank. And what is it going to mean when you do have to implement free, prior, informed consent? And what is this going to mean, not just for Indigenous people, but when we work in communities that are vulnerable? How is that going to be managed as well? Because there's a whole spectrum of communities that we have to work with. And for the CAO, this is a constant challenge. And in many of the situations that we've found ourselves, or the bank has found itself, the definition of identifying Indigenous communities is sometimes irregular. There was a case 2 years ago in Papua New Guinea where the bank challenged the inspection panel on the identification of Indigenous people. I mean, it's very clear to me that the bank doesn't know the country that it's working in, a country of 860 and more distinct language groups and customs, and the bank challenged the inspection panel on that people were not Indigenous to their territories. So their challenges within that broader framework. What can I say about what Ciaran has put to us? I think this is extraordinary work, really extraordinary work, and we at the CCIA think this is tremendously valuable for the work that we do. We are very supportive of participatory processes, but also the process where people have the right to be able to share their knowledge about the territory that they live in, the country that they live in, and then from that kind of analysis of local knowledge, then moving that into a negotiation phase where you have substance to work from to be able to negotiate a benefits arrangement for the community, and then pulling together what are the benefits that is going to be long-lasting for those communities who live in that country. And I use the word country because in Australian Indigenous communities you use it as country. In Papua New Guinea we would look at it as as tribe and territory, but to be able to negotiate benefits so that they are for the long term. Now, let's be very honest and clear about this, and we had this conversation with Ciaran, who's worked with Indigenous communities. Indigenous communities are no different from fractious communities that we all live in. It's not that we're all related. Somewhere along the line we know our boundaries and we are all one big happy community. Surviving in an Indigenous community, I think, is tougher than in the ordinary world or the other world. It is constant negotiation of your place in that community and a constant building of that relationship and a constant meeting of your obligation. And when you don't meet those obligations, it doesn't matter if you live in a city, you still have to send your resources home when there are duties and obligations to be met. And since the invention of mobile telephones in Papua New Guinea, you get many calls about what is happening, and you can organise the movement of food and trucks and everything in Aboriginal communities, in Aboriginal communities, in our communities in the Pacific, and I'm sure also in parts of Africa and Latin America, that you are obliged to keep those obligations going. So I think we've got to be very clear that this is not an easy piece of work. So that's why I really commend the work that was done, and the one I know a bit more about is the Kimberley, and all the different elements of society there, and to be able to have the communities there bring together an ESIA that then was accepted by the government and by the company is tremendous. The issue around benefits, I think also that there is an assumption in that some communities, no, let me go back. When you have an ESIA that there has been a process of analysis and then a negotiation and then benefits, I think you get a much more substantive package of benefits that are managed for the long term. Now, I think in Papua New Guinea we don't have a good track record of that. We've just completed one of the largest gas deal that will last for 35 years with ExxonMobil. What does it mean in terms of the benefits there? If you go into the areas where we have oil exploration and oil development and now gas, those communities just jumped onto the benefits straight away. They didn't have that kind of they didn't have the fundamentals that were established by having an ESIA that they were involved in to build so that they have a stake in it for the future. A lot of greedy fingers got in there, and there will be nothing to show in the oil fields. In the mining industry, I think they have a better record in Papua New Guinea, not because of the participation in the ESIA, but I think when you move water and you move earth, it's so physically visible to you, and because of the interest of leadership and the kinds of corporations that we had coming in the mining sector, that the benefits and future generations trusts were able to emerge. There was always interpreters there to be able to interpret that for other people. Whereas the case that Ciaran is putting to us is that there are not being interlocutors to interpret. There has to be that direct involvement of the communities so that they contribute to the value of their knowledge to the broader development project that's going to happen. Just on the issue of participatory processes. Over the years, CAO has tried very hard, and we come in after there's a problem, not before the fact. We come in when there has been a negative impact. We have implemented participatory processes on water monitoring, on the land identification around palm oil sector. The water monitoring was in the Yanacocha mine, etc. But I don't believe that this has really taken hold in the institution. The publication we did on water monitoring, it was very interesting. It was private sector who kept asking for this, not the institution. So I think we've got institutional challenges of how to think about how society lives both in the Indigenous population, vulnerable populations, and other populations who live around broader projects. We see the value of this. The CAO sees the value of the preparation of ESIAs by Indigenous communities and vulnerable communities for the implementation of free, prior, informed consent. The IFC does not have one project yet that has IFPI. There is one project, I understand, that is under review now, where free, prior, informed consent will be done. I think there have been challenges for the environmental and social scientists on how they're going to do this, and I think this is really valuable work. I've raised my concerns about the vulnerable communities. I think what's really important now from where we sit in the CAO is how we, as an office, with our experiences, the cases that we've had, can assist to build this case so that we get ESIAs and the participation, well, not the participation, but the doing of it by those that are going to be directly impacted really onto the agenda at the World Bank Group. And we'd like to pursue that. That's all I have to say.
Emily.
You guys, I'll just use back there.
First, I really want to thank you, Ciaran, for this excellent presentation. You've given us all a lot to think about and reflect on. And thinking about the tools that you've described, I think each offers a really important contribution to the efforts of communities to influence decision-making processes about their use of their land and natural resources. And this is particularly critical in the context of oil gas mining projects, where social and environmental risks can be so considerable. And where we're seeing projects expanding, moving to more remote areas to keep pace with the global demand for energy and natural resources. And as you highlighted at the outset, unfortunately, the poorest and most marginalized communities, including Indigenous communities, are often excluded from potential project benefits from oil and mining projects. So we see these types of tools as a critical way to ensure that community views and priorities and related risks are taken into account. And in your excellent briefing paper that you mentioned earlier that you've prepared with BIC, one point that you made really resonated with me, the point about the weaknesses of traditional environmental assessment processes. And I was reflecting on experience I had just last year. Last October, I was in Kenya, in Turkana, which is the poorest county of the country in the north, where there are very low literacy levels, and 60% of the county is pastoralist. And we were in a meeting with dozens of representatives of local Turkana community members and also of civil society. And at that point, one representative of the National Environmental Agency stood up and he held up an EIA, this lengthy document, and he said, I'm confused about the fact that so many people are saying that they had no idea there was an EIA. Here it is, we have it in our office, and I have 50 signatures from community members attesting to the fact that this was public. But meanwhile, no one in the room had any idea that such an EIA had been presented, and given literacy challenges, even had they known, it would have been very difficult for them to access this information. And so, it didn't come as a huge surprise to me when just last month, Tullow Oil had to halt their project development due to community protest for a period of time. And I think, that's not to say that this is the particular fault of one entity, or that the community-controlled impact assessment is the one solution, but I think it's just to show really the range of how far there still is yet to go, and how these critical tools can be so useful both from community perspective and also for companies themselves. It really is what I see as a win-win opportunity. I think it was also interesting to note in your briefing paper, you highlighted a study that the World Bank did of the implementation of their Indigenous Peoples policy over 2006 and 2008. And just to pull out a couple of the statistics there to show that social impact assessment was inadequate in 40% of the cases reviewed, and that this issue of broad community support was evidenced in less than half of the projects reviewed as well. So, in addition to these strong participatory impact assessment processes, I think, the agreements are a critical tool to reduce the risk of uncertainty and instability. And one publication that came out interestingly actually was commissioned by the World Bank in 2010 by the environmental consultancy ERM. I thought was quite interesting. They looked at negotiated agreements between mining sector and communities in Papua New Guinea, Ghana, and Argentina. And that report also said that there are huge benefits from these types of agreements to be gained when they're done in a robust manner, including averting and mitigating negative project impacts, improving stakeholder relationships. They noted that building trust was one of what companies saw as a huge value coming out of the process, and also helping to promote mutually beneficial, sustainable benefits for all parties, including pro-poor benefits for communities. So I thought that was an interesting thing to reflect on, and again, sort of underscoring this case of win-win for all parties. To mention, just from Oxfam perspective, in addition to these particular instruments, there's a few others that we've seen as quite useful in helping to facilitate productive engagement of communities in decision making. So I won't go into a lot of detail, but just to mention a few of them. Community protocols, we're seeing this used a lot more as a way for communities to document their own traditional decision-making processes very early on at the outset. Participatory mapping, there's been some interesting stuff done using community engagement and even developing icons for GPS tools so that communities can actually take control of doing the mapping themselves. Human rights impact assessments, and then finally, FPIC policies. We see that as very critical both for the private sector and for governments. And, Oxfam recognizes FPIC as a right for Indigenous communities, a legal right for Indigenous communities, but we also see this as best practice for safeguarding relevant rights for all projects that present significant risks to communities, and those include, of course, extractive industries projects. So we're very much hoping that the World Bank will follow IFC's lead and include an FPIC policy in their revised safeguards. And I just wanted to also note briefly that we have some tools available, some research that we've done recently. Our Community Consent Index came out last year and has the public positions of 28 oil, gas, and mining companies on issues of consultation and consent. We have some case studies in a report called From Controversy to Consensus to kind of get, we have the Community Consent Index looking at the breadth of company positions, but the other report looks at case studies in Peru and Bolivia on agreement making with Indigenous communities to get a little bit more narrow and drill down on those aspects. Finally, we have a new report that we've just put out that looks at FPIC in the Philippines, which is quite interesting because in the Philippines it's actually been required by law since 1997. But very recently, just last year, they put out new regulations that I think are quite useful in thinking about how a government that's really struggled with effective implementation over more than a decade is trying to get at some of those challenges through using a regulatory mechanism. So we have those out front for those of you that are interested. And then maybe I'll just conclude with a couple of questions that I thought might be interesting to talk about here. One is, in communities where we're seeing there exist significant inequalities of education, wealth, power. Is there a danger that these mechanisms will be monopolized by unrepresented elites? And if so, how can we avoid those dangers? And then you touched a little bit on issues of gender in one of the case studies that you mentioned, and I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more broadly how you think those issues play out in the context of these particular instruments.
So thank you, Emily and Meg, both for helping add some dimensions, institutional dimensions to this discussion. And I guess without any additional provocation to open it up for questions. And if anyone would like to ask any of the panelists questions, I guess I could help moderate that at this point. So please. Nadia and then Rachel.
Hi, I'm Nadia with Bank Information Center's Middle East and North Africa program. Thank you all for the presentations. I don't do a lot of work on Indigenous people's policies and related impact assessments, and so it was quite interesting for me to hear. And actually, I was wondering if any of you could touch on, are there any, maybe Ciaran especially, are there any aspects of a community impact assessment that you could see could be applicable to non-Indigenous communities? And if so, what are the kinds of projects where that might be important, and are there preconditions that should be there for the community impact assessment to be successful?
I think that there is no reason why a great deal of this shouldn't be applied to affected communities more broadly. I cannot see why they wouldn't be. I mean, some of the challenges might be different. Some of the specific methods that you use might be different. But the fundamental principle in terms of allowing the community to drive the way in which the impact assessment happens, I think could certainly be applied. Preconditions. I think that there are some important preconditions. One is resourcing, and adequate resourcing to complete the process. I think that a risk with these processes is that if you start them and you're not able to complete them, you can simply add to people's frustrations. So you can create expectations and add to people's frustrations. So I think a critical precondition is, and typically what happens with the cases I've talked about, is that you have a funding protocol or a negotiation protocol at the beginning of the process. So in the one for the LNG precinct, for example, that protocol was between the regional Indigenous organisation, the Kimberley Land Council, and the Government of Western Australia. And it provided for funding of the process the whole way through to completion. I think that's critical. In some cases, I've been involved in some of these impact assessments which have been done on a shoestring. Where communities have not had a lot of money, where they haven't had a government or a private sector developer who's willing to do it. The community has got some external funding and mobilised a lot of its own resources, but the same still applies. I think you really need to think it through till the end. I mean, and you never know, by definition, if it's community controlled, you can never tell where it's going to go. So I'm not suggesting that you can script this out in detail, but I think that's a very important consideration. And the second one, and maybe I could use this to bring in Emily's question about inequality and power within communities. is that it's essential to have a strategy in place to make sure that the impact assessment is as comprehensive as possible in terms of the catching different sectors of the community's population. Again, if you don't do that, if some people in a community see a process like this happening and they're left out of it, then you're just creating another set of problems. So I think it's critical to have a consultation strategy, and that often is about very simple things. In the communities that I work in Australia and Canada, transport is absolutely critical. So not all families will have access to vehicles, typically. Not all families will have the opportunity. If you hold a meeting out on country, which people like to do, you have to be very careful that you're not leaving some people behind. And they're sitting there, which I've seen, sitting there watching other people go out to participate in this. So, and the two things are linked. So plan your resourcing and make sure that that in turn is linked to a strategy that deliberately tries to pull in the different elements in a community.
Can I make a comment on that links to the benefits stream? I think that, and I'm not always trying to raise the negatives, but the challenges you've got to keep in mind. On this gender issue, matrilineal societies where benefits distribution is done through male leadership. On the island of Lihir, one of the largest gold mines in Papua New Guinea, matrilineal society has been marginalised because of the corporatisation of the community. And the corporatisation of the community has been because of the benefit stream and how the benefit stream is managed. So the question here is, if the design of an impact assessment had been more thoroughly, and this is a question that I'm putting to all of us, I don't have all the evidence on this one, is if the impact assessments had been done in a more participatory fashion with the women because of the matrilineal component, and in the matrilineal society distribution is through the female as well in terms of fees, particularly on this here, then would that have balanced the outcome now in a modern society where distribution of benefits goes through the male, and then the whole exercise becomes a corporate exercise of the landowner company?
And just quickly following on from that, in another IBA I was involved in for the Argyle Diamond Mine in Western Australia, women were very well aware of this risk, and what they insisted on was that there is a trust to support cultural activity, and it's actually split in two. Half of it is for women's cultural activity and half of it is for men's. Half of the benefit, the revenue stream, goes into the women's trust and half goes into the men. The women have complete control over their half of the trust. No man has any say about how the money is used. Now that, and again, but it gets back to Meg's point that those women were involved in the design from the beginning, and that was their solution.
Maybe just one quick point also on this issue of the applicability of the community-controlled impact assessments. I think, in the context of the extractive industries, regardless of whether the communities impacted are Indigenous, it's very relevant. And just to give one sort of extreme example is on a trip to Ghana recently, we learned that there was a mining project that was being built on sacred cemetery ground, and this was creating obviously a lot of frustration among community members. And had there been done a community-controlled impact assessment, of course, this would be one of the first key issues that would have emerged. And those kinds of issues can kind of fall by the wayside when that extra step is not taken.
Rachel, Chris, back row, and Amy, and then Rachel, please.
So to build on that theme of preconditions and some of the challenges Meg had raised. Meg had particularly flagged that this sort of process could be especially difficult in countries where there are weak land rights for Indigenous peoples, governance structures of the state is weak, or the Indigenous Peoples community itself is fractured. So do you see these, do you see that it's actually important, or is it a precondition to have strong land rights for Indigenous peoples, to have a strong state government, to have a coherent Indigenous peoples community that can function as a community? Are these preconditions? Is this something that can work in all countries, regardless of the condition, or is this something that really is only going to work in countries like Australia?
I think it's important not to forget that when Aboriginal people in Australia started to do this, it was before the critical High Court decision called Mabo that recognised inherent Aboriginal rights. It was at a point in time in the very beginning of the 1990s when Aboriginal people were much more marginalised in Australia than they are now. I mean, a great deal has changed in 20 years. So I don't think we should underestimate the extent to which when people started this, it was very tough for them to do it. They faced a lot of obstacles. Neither do I want to underestimate, though, the extent to which there are much greater obstacles in other contexts. But on the other hand, it's certainly the case there are some Indigenous communities in Australia that I could identify, and I would suggest it would be very difficult at the moment to get this sort of process going, because they are so heavily fractured that bluntly, you would probably have a huge fight over the very first step, because people simply fight about anything and everything. They are so fractured. So, I mean, clearly, it doesn't make sense to spend resources in that situation and possibly to worsen conflicts that are there. On the other hand, I have also seen these processes have a marked effect in terms of managing and mitigating internal conflict. So that if you do have at least some basic level of consensus, and often there is consensus around the need for this sort of approach, right? There may not be consensus about what people want to come out of it, but once you get into it, because one of the things this does is that it brings out into the open the different interests of different groups within a community. And especially if you're following it up with a negotiation, it creates a forum in which you're confronted with the problem. The problem is this: if we bring our differences into the negotiating room, we are going to get killed. Now, if you go into a negotiation room with a big company or a state and you are divided, you don't last long. And often that puts pressure on people to sit down together in the community and to negotiate a way around this. So it's not unusual for a very substantial negotiation to happen inside the community before you ever get to the, quote, negotiating table. So I think it can be an instrument for dealing with conflict as well as having to overcome conflict.
Maybe we can take several questions in succession just to get them on the table. So first Chris, and then we'll go right in a row in the back.
You could say a little bit more about the conditional consent. You have experience with where consent has been withdrawn. Have you evolved the mechanism for what happens when there is a withdrawal of consent, or what the trigger is? You mentioned about pre-negotiated automatic effects, or court. You go to court and you sort of fight it out there. You open that up a little bit more.
So I had a question that was partially answered actually with him talking about how the groups within themselves were being forced to negotiate before the negotiation to have a consolidated stance. But I guess I'm still, sorry, Laura from the State Department. I still have sort of two questions about how this works in an area with low governance, because I really find that to be a significant challenge that Meg pointed out, and I'm very interested in how it could be addressed. So One question that I have is if a project crosses the lines of more than one traditional people's group, or if those line boundaries are not well defined within a country, do you see the potential for this to work? And would you have to have entirely separate processes in each community, have the communities negotiate with each other, or would they be at the table with the government and the mining company? I mean, maybe I'm adding too much of a complication to a complicated problem, but I'm wondering how that would work. So especially with Papua New Guinea, for example, if you've got several groups that are being touched by a project. And the other one was, assuming that within an Indigenous community, there are, right, some groups that are marginalized within that community, right? I understand how bringing about their own interests you would sort of make the community aware that this marginalized group within that Indigenous community has an interest that's not being addressed. But would you, in facilitating this, promote that it be addressed? Is that sort of stepping within the decision-making that's been agreed upon by the Indigenous community, which has led to that group being marginalized? Or how do you address very marginalized groups within Indigenous communities without being very paternalistic about it and saying that these need to be addressed? I guess those are the
I'm going to answer, if it's okay, because I have to go on an important exercise in a minute on a case that we're dealing with. Look, if you look at a lot of the cases that the CAO has, a lot of them fundamentally are in places where there are weak land rights for people. And I always ask the team, and I know I do it myself when I go to a community, I say, what are the land issues here? Because if you get an answer around land rights, you can always work out you've got an idea of how marginalized people are in those communities because they have no voice. They just have no voice as to who controls land, etc. And if you look at what the bank as a group is supposed to do, is look at, now that the new president is saying it's going to be one World Bank group, and if you looked at a case like the Wilmar case that we had around palm oil, if those land issues had been more clearly managed and identified by the state or by the people themselves in Kalimantan, the potential for that conflict would have been reduced. But because there's such protection of the state's control of land in certain countries, people just have no way to move. But does that mean we don't go in there? The bank will say no. We go there because these are member countries and we're going to do the business. So what is the function of the project team? Is to be really aware of these issues, much more aware than what we would say that they are aware of what is the challenges for the people themselves living there, and how are they going to cope with large-scale development amongst their midst, and what are the rights that they have. But you asked the question about conflict of communities overlaying each other. If you look at the pipeline project where US companies actually have been involved in Papua New Guinea, we don't incorporate the land. Once you start, this is in Papua New Guinea, not Australian territory, Ciaran can speak to. You don't go around with a GPS and start measuring land territory, because the minute you do that, you have a big battle on your hands. Territory is always in fluctuation in terms of arrangements that have happened, either battles or over land, or other transactions, and certain portions go to a community and then they move back to another community or to another one. So we have legislation that incorporates the people as an incorporated land group. It's the identification of the people who have the purview over this territory. And yes, that is a challenge for the developer because you have to identify every household. And in the current gas project, well, of course, they arrived there thinking, father, mother, children. Oh, no. You know, these are polygamous traditional societies, and each wife said, excuse me, I am also a household and have control of it. So all these wives and the households had to be considered in the development. in the assessment in the count of households within each territory. But there is no guarantee that there will be differences over land, so you trying to manage that is to incorporate the community rather than the territory itself.
So I'm sorry to make this more complicated, but following up on the presentation that was made earlier, if you were trying to implement something like what was discussed in a situation such as the one you described in Papua, would you get together several different groupings of populations within one meeting? Would you have to have separate meetings with each?
Yeah, well let's talk about Bougainville.
Okay, so in Bougainville, you have, you remember from the map, you have this huge open pit, you have a corridor for the tailings going down to the coast, you have impacts on the coast. In the other direction, you had the pipeline going down to the port, the mine town is down there. So there are at least 9 distinct landowning groups. Now they have all been incorporated, and they they appoint representatives to an umbrella, what they call an umbrella body, which sits over the top, and which will bear primary responsibility for input into the negotiations. So that's how that's done. It's pretty much the same in Australia. One of the agreements I was involved in had 11 landowning groups, 4 separate Indigenous communities. Each of those had representation on a steering group. Now, that doesn't solve the issue. I mean, these matters are intensely political. There will always be politics around this. There will always be jockeying for a position. It's endless. It's just part of the reality, and you have to deal with it. In terms of the other part of your question about what position does someone adopt that's facilitating this, the key position is inclusiveness from my point of view. So my position always is that we must include all of the people who are affected or may be offended. That's the fundamental principle. Now, if somebody wants to exclude some groups, and they often do, because they're looking further down the track to when the benefits emerge, they actually generally don't care too much about the impact assessment. Generally they say, open the doors, everyone can come in. But when it comes to benefit sharing, then you will often get attempts to exclude people. And to some extent, you have to step back and let that politics play itself out. But at the impact assessment stage, the principle is inclusiveness. And the other thing, because my work follows through to the negotiations, my position always is that if you leave people out, then there's a strong likelihood that there will be conflict in your community when the negotiations are happening, and that will undermine your position. So it's a very pragmatic, there's a principle and then there's pragmatism. And you basically say to people, if you want a good deal, then you have to have these people in the room, because if they're not in the room, they're going to cause problems to you. In terms of the first question about consent and how withdrawal of consent and how that operates, yes, in Australia, Indigenous people have gone to court and used the judicial system when there have been breaches of agreements. That's rare, and people try to avoid it because it's expensive and it's uncertain. So you never know which way a court is going to jump. So the emphasis is much more on building automatic adjustments into agreements. So for example, if one form of benefit doesn't materialize, you provide in the agreement that an alternative form of benefit must be provided. Simple example, a lot of agreements have targets in terms of Indigenous employment. If the company doesn't reach the target, then it has to do something that will create an equivalent benefit. For example, one agreement says that the salaries that the company would have paid to the workers that it ended up not employing have to be put into a business development fund to support Indigenous businesses, which will create jobs for people. So because of the issues around implementation, and because of the problems of going to court, increasing emphasis on trying to build those adjustment mechanisms into the agreements.
Just on that, I would urge that all agreements are public. Are they in Australia?
No.
Yeah, and I think that has an impact on the countries, particularly in developing countries. People want to know because it has broader implications for what is the share of the benefits that go into the common pool, into budgetary support, and then what are the communities getting and what is the deal. And the gas project in Papua New Guinea with Exxon was signed in New York, not on our land, so I have a real beef with that.
Very, very importantly though, that in Australia, agreements are always public to the community. It's a very important distinction.
Yeah.
That they are confidential as against the wider world, but they are public to the community. And all the agreements I've been involved in, there is extensive community consultation about the agreement before it's signed. People are provided with all of the information about it, with detailed summaries, with translations. In Canada, this does not always happen. There are cases in Canada where IBAs have been signed by the leadership without the community being fully appraised of what was in them. And a couple of those cases have led to serious conflict within the community when people have realized what's happening.
Just to follow on that point, actually, in the Philippines, in their new regulation that I mentioned on FPIC, they put that provision as well, that agreements need to be not only made public, but there needs to be a validation process by community members. So it's in order to, they've had issues as well of there being challenges in representation and communities not feeling like the appropriate leaders were engaged in agreement signing. So now, as a result of this regulation, agreements need to be brought in a public forum, and the key points of the agreement need to be presented in a way that's accessible to communities, and it says that in the law. So I think it's an interesting provision they put in place.
Meg, I know you need to leave, and I'd like to thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate it. We won't hold it
We'll be
against.
grateful for this one.
We had two other questions in queue, and let's ask this one first, and then let's ask them both and get them out.
It's Gina from the CAO. In part, the questions already been asked and in part answered around the community's right to revoke their consent to a project. Often you can't envisage the impacts that the project's going to have. And so, is there some institutionalization on enabling communities to revoke, not necessarily having to go to court, where courts are, they wait 10 years for cases to be heard. So can that be built in? Because one concern we have around these kinds of methodologies is that social licenses to operate are key, and private sector companies know that. And what we need to avoid is them using this tool as another means of obtaining that social license to operate, and then not enable communities to take ownership of their environment, of their social impacts, because they gave consent to the project when it started. And the other question relates to what does consent mean? I'm not sure, I'm not very clear from the performance standards of the IFC that we know what consent actually means. If you've got a community where 80% of the community say yes to a project and 20% say no, is that consent? Is that broad community support? I'm not sure how we navigate those questions.
I'm Amy from Bank Information Center, and my question is about the preconditions that you mentioned. You mentioned that number one is for the community to have enough resources to continue throughout the process, and I assume you're talking about financial resources here. So from your experience, is it who should pay the cost of this lengthy process? Is it the lender or the borrower or the community? Because sometimes hiring those type of experts is really expensive for the community. And is there any pros and cons if any of them is the one funding the process?
Let's take those two. Isabel, please.
Just one other question to throw into the pot. Isabel Mania from Oxfam. I think this question about implementation is really important, of how once these benefit agreements are signed or even the EIA is finalized, how do we get the findings implemented? And I wanted to see if maybe both of you could talk about what are some mechanisms to make sure that it happens? Are there any examples? And I think that one that you mentioned, Ciaran, was sort of the incentive structures for the consultants and making them accountable to the community. But if we could talk a little bit more about that, of kind of specific mechanisms that might help to influence implementation.
Okay, a social license to operate. There is a risk, you're quite right. Some companies sign these agreements, and particularly where there's revenue sharing, they take the view, we're paying the money, now basically bluntly bugger off. Right, go away. We don't want to talk to you. That's to some extent more noticeable with companies from particular countries. I would say that in my experience that's often a response by Chinese companies. That they're of the view that they're essentially paying for a license to operate, and the agreement is their license, and then they just want to be left to get on with it. The response to that is number one, that you have, of course, a whole series of other provisions that require the Indigenous parties to be involved in management. Number two, that there's a very important education process that happens through these negotiations and through the impact assessment. And some of what the Indigenous communities have to do is to educate companies that this is about a relationship. And even in cases that are not that extreme, it's often very difficult for companies to understand that in fact, Aboriginal people, unlike most non-Indigenous people, do not see a contract as an end point. They actually see it as a starting point. As far as they're concerned, they're not giving anybody a social license to operate. What they are doing is marking a critical stage, but just marking a stage in the development of a relationship. And companies are often quite taken aback when people turn up 3 weeks after signing an agreement and saying, oh, we want you to do something about that. And the company says, no, that's not in the agreement. And they say, yeah, and we want you to do something about it. You know, so I think the only effective response to that is simply to refute that view and to do what comes naturally to Indigenous people, which is to view this as a relationship. In terms of what exactly is the consent and whether 80% is consent and so on, that's a difficult question, but the risk, of course, is that you can have a view that Indigenous communities should be able to be unanimous about these things, and that's unrealistic as well. So what's consent is contextual. In most of the cases I'm talking about, if you go through this sort of process, then you tend to have very strong views one way or the other. Not necessarily, by the way, in favour of development. I should mention that in that site selection process I talked to you about, and some of the images I showed you, the image of the meeting where the woman was standing up making a point, that was a meeting where an individual landowner group was deciding about whether or not they would continue to negotiate, and they decided no. So 8 groups in that process refused to have an LNG project on their territory, and that was an end of it. But in most cases, having gone through that process, there was a strong consensus. Now, I can't put a figure on that, and in many ways it's not my business to. If you've set up a participative process like this and people say to you, we have come to a consensus on this matter, then that's the consent. That's the decision. And I think that's really important. Because to me, free, prior, informed consent really is not a good term. And to a lot of Aboriginal people I work with, it's not a good term. What they think it should be called is free, prior, informed decision making. And that's a significant difference. In terms of the cost, where Where does the money come from? Where should it come from? Do people contribute? All communities contribute a lot to these processes. Now that's often overlooked by companies and by state authorities that are kicking in cash, but all communities contribute a lot. All of the people that you see in these meetings, they are there rather than somewhere else, right? They're putting their time. The organisations, the Kimberley Land Council that organises these things, they put a huge amount of their own staff time in. There's an opportunity cost in that they're not doing other things. So in every case, if you're going to have a genuinely participative process, by definition the community is putting in a lot of resources. But typically then, the rest of it depends on the project. And you negotiate with private sector developers. If it's an infrastructure project, typically you're negotiating with the state, the relevant state authorities. And it's a matter of trying to put together a package, often between a number of different groups and the community's own resources, to make sure that this can happen. You might want to jump in there on the third one, and then I'll come in.
Well, yeah, I wanted to say something about this point of consent, which is obviously a very sticky and difficult one. But I also feel that one thing that I've been reflecting on the past few years is that communities generally have decision-making systems that they put in place all the time. You know, they're making community decisions on a daily basis, so they know how they make decisions. I think the issue is everything is amplified when there's all of this money coming in, and so it puts a microscope on it, and that can sometimes really create a lot of problems for the existing structures. And we were on a field visit a year or so ago to a community of Saman in Ghana that's affected by a mining project, and they have a traditional chieftaincy system and a council of elders that supports the chief. And they were telling us, when we decided to build a school, so we all came together and we know exactly who gives what and we all support that process. But when it came to the mining company, all of a sudden then the chief had disappointed them and made a deal with the company, and so they were feeling very frustrated. But they knew exactly who was accountable, and they were holding him accountable because he wasn't respecting them. And while there were, even in this particular example, while the elders were male, women also had, I participated in a separate meeting with women where they knew exactly their route for influencing decision making, and that had been cut off because of the particular mining project. So, and this, getting at Isabel's point a little bit too about implementation, this is why when I mentioned earlier this issue of community protocols, I really think it's so critical, because a lot of times, well-meaning developers or government will come in thinking they know how to ask the question, and really the first question they should be asking is, how do you want to be consulted? How do you want to be engaged? And just one other example of that, I think Peru is a really interesting case right now, because some of you know they have an Indigenous Peoples consultation law which was just put into place a few years ago and is now being tested for the very first time in the extractive industries in an oil project in the north. And it was interesting to me that already there was sort of conflict at the very outset, because the agency from the government that wanted to manage the consultation sent a letter saying, we're going to come visit you to begin discussing how to consult on such and such date. And already reports were coming out of frustration. No, ask us when we want to be consulted. So, I mean, these things that we kind of take for granted sometimes, the process points can be quite fundamental in making sure these things are effective.
Just following up on the last question, the implementation one. One of the difficulties is that the teams that do the negotiation of the agreements typically finish up on the day the agreement is signed. And that's a big problem in terms of implementation. So the same people who do the negotiation don't do the implementation. To try and there are major problems. There have been a number of studies of IBAs in Australia and Canada that highlight the difficulty. What people are increasingly doing are providing that the agreements themselves have the resources contained in them for their implementation. So, for example, Voisey's Bay, which is a nickel mine in Labrador in Canada, the IBAs are with two Indigenous groups, the Inuit and the Innu, and in both cases they have a full-time employee who's an employee of the Indigenous government but funded by the project. And their sole job is to focus on implementation of the agreement. Not on programs. They're not training people doing the employment bit or the training bit. They're not rangers looking after the cultural heritage bit. They're just focused on, is this agreement being implemented? And they are there till the end of the project, for the whole life of the project. So that's really where the emphasis is now in terms of good practice. It's in building that into the agreements themselves.
you looking for more questions?
Just scanning for hands, but please.
Okay, I mean, personally, I'm interested in hearing what some of our other civil society organizations are wondering about, but I'm always happy to provide questions. Following up on the question about funding, can you give us an idea of typically how much following a community controlled impact assessment process would impact a broader ESIA process in terms of time and cost? What would it add, if anything, in terms of time and cost to what might otherwise exist?
It certainly adds to the cost. I mean, there's no doubt about that. You know, the cost of the sort of process that I've described and that I tried to give you some sense of, compared to a situation where you turn up with a package, an information package, have one community meeting and then go away, it's bound to be an additional cost, at least in the short term. The extent of that varies with the complexity of the project, the number of groups involved, the remoteness of the area. In my experience, they have ranged from $70,000 to several millions of dollars. So the Kimberley process that I mentioned there involved 13 groups. But I mean, it's easy to lose scale when someone flashes up a map like that. The Kimberley is the size of the United Kingdom. Okay, so that region I was talking about is the size of the United Kingdom. It's got 12,000 Aboriginal people spread over an area the size of the United Kingdom. Except, unlike the United Kingdom, it doesn't have roads, or it has very few roads. So it's a very expensive proposition, bringing people together repeatedly, allowing them to meet out on their traditional country. So in that case, you are talking about millions of dollars. What does it add in terms of timelines? The Kimberley Land Council finished its process completely, and the federal and state governments were then waiting for everybody else to catch up. So the Kimberley Land Council had submitted its impact assessment report, and the proponent and the state government had still not submitted theirs. So there was actually no impact on the timeline from a project point of view. That's not always necessarily the case, but I'll just give you that illustration to show sometimes governments and project developers say, no, we can't do this, it will take much too long. Right? We'll never get the project up. There's no evidence to suggest that on the basis of the cases that I talked about. But the other thing that you have to consider in terms of cost is the alternative. So, towards the end of this process, the Western Australian government changed. There was an election, a Conservative government was elected. It decided it didn't like this process, which was based on free, prior, informed consent. It went ahead and picked a site at the very end and sought a compulsory acquisition order from the courts to acquire the land compulsorily. That led to huge conflict, protests, opposition, people chaining themselves to rigs, and major delays in the process. And major costs to the company. At one side, the lead proponent was losing $2 million a day, $2 million a day, because their rigs were tied up and could not be used. Now, $2 million buys you a lot of community-controlled impact.
I'm told we have another meeting that's going to start at noon, and so what I'd like to do is Ciaran is going to be here and would be happy to follow up with any of these questions, but before we get rushed out of here, I just simply want to thank our panelists and our audience in Oxfam for allowing us to hold this discussion here. We encourage you to keep asking these questions and know that at least the reason why we're elevating these issues is because we do think they're within reach for the bank to consider to include as provisions within its eventual safeguard policy framework. And BIC, among others, we're working for a while to try to see that happens. So on behalf of BIC and Oxfam, thanks Ciaran and thanks Emily.